Even when the world stops, education pauses, learning continues.
Kunin adlaw may pagsira, may pagtunod, diri ang pangaraman.
Sulong sa pagbabago, utak at puso pa rin, tatak sitihay.
Welcome, learners. My name is Teacher Arvin. I will be your teacher in this subject, 21st Century Literature from the Philippines and the world. Before we will start, I'd like to establish general rules for our class. First, set up everything you need before we start the class. Second, join the class before the time. Third, dress properly. Fourth, be in an area where your gadgets can have the best connectivity. Go to a quiet place and put your microphones on mute. Use clap, thumbs up, raise hand reactions if you want to agree, react, and raise questions. Let's move on to our topic for this morning. Of course, the subject that we will have, my name. Good morning, learners again. My name is Teacher Arvin. I will be your teacher in this subject, 21st Century Literature from the Philippines and the world. Okay, so we'll take a journey to discover 21st century literature from the Philippines and the world. All right. So before we will start with our discussion, I just would like to inform you that later on, at the end of our discussion, we will have our alpha and our delta. When we say our alpha, that means the things that you have learned from our discussion, and delta are the things that you need to improve out from the topic that we will discuss for this morning. So the reason why I show this to you is because later on we will have our question and answer portion at the end of our discussion. Is it clear? Is it clear to everyone?
Yes, sir.
Right.
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
So,
sir.
okay, that's great.
Yes, sir.
So, okay, that's great. For today's objective, all right, so for today's objective, we will be writing a close analysis and critical interpretations of literary text and doing an adaptation of these require from the learner the ability to, number one, identify the geographic, linguistic, and ethnic dimensions of Philippine literary history from the pre-colonial to the contemporary period. So the reason why I highlighted pre-colonial is because that will be the focus of our discussion for this morning. All right, so let's move on to the subtopics that we will have for this morning. That would be literature, definition of literature. Second, importance of literature. Third is that we will also learn riddle or the definition of riddle and how it is important in the pre-colonial period. First things first, let's move on to what is meant of literature. Okay, I know you are curious of what is really the definition of literature. So let's define literature. All right. So literature is anything that is printed. Okay, anything that is printed, as long as it is related to the ideas and feelings of people, whether it is true or just a product of one's imagination. So let's elaborate further the definition of literature based from the screen. Let's say that literature came from a Latin word which means Latin word litera, which means acquaintance with letters. Now, meaning to say, literature is considered as works of creative imagination, including poetry, drama, fiction, non-fiction, and in some instances, journalism and song. Okay, so meaning to say there are different considerations, right? So long that it is printed and you can relate out from the printed materials. Also, literature is a body of work, either written, oral, or visual. It contains imaginative language that realistically portrays emotions, thoughts, and experiences of human condition. All right. Now, please take down notes of the definition of literature. It's because we later on, at the end of our discussion, we will have our alpha and our delta portion. Now, let's move on to the importance of literature. Now, you might ask yourself, you might ask yourself the importance of literature, right? Now, let's move on to the first importance of literature, all right? So, first importance of literature. Literature, first one is studying literature is like looking at the mirror of life, where man's experiences, his innermost feelings and thoughts are reflected. Now, it is true that when we study literature, we read books, right? We read books, we read novels, stories. So it's like we mirror to our life and society once we read those literary pieces. It also concretizes man's array of values, emotions, actions, and ideas. Like you relate yourself out from the books that you've read, right? So that's the first importance of literature. Now, let's move on to the second importance of literature. Now, according to the screen that we have here, you travel to other realms in times through the text you read. So it is indeed true that through literature we understand not only the past life, okay, the past life of a nation, but also its present. Okay, so it's like through literature we can time travel. We can travel to different realms of time. We can learn what happened from the past or even the present. Now, as I have just mentioned from our objectives a while ago, that one of our objective is knowing the pre-colonial period. So, meaning to say, we will also travel to the pre-colonial period of this topic or the through literature. Now let's move on to the third importance of literature. Now, the third importance of literature is you understand about your own culture and others. Meaning to say, through literature, we learn the culture of people across time and space. We will learn the tradition, the culture, the belief system of other places. Like, for example, if you will read a book, right? A book which is not being printed in the Philippines, like a book from Korea or a book or a literary piece from different places, literary piece from Japan. Once you read those literary pieces, you will also learn the culture, the tradition, and the belief system of that place. So that means you understand about your own culture and others. Now, let's go back. First is you can travel through realms and times. Second, you will understand the culture. At the same time, the last one is that you will learn the importance and you can relate out from the text that you have read. Now, let's move on to the geographic, linguistic, and ethnic dimensions of the Philippine literary history from the pre-colonial period. I know that in your past years, from your grade 10, grade 9, grade 8, you had this already in your Araling Panlipunan section. You've learned what happened from the past. You've learned what happened from the pre-colonial period. Now, long before the Spaniards came to the Philippines, Filipinos had civilization, right? Partly came from the Malay settlers and partly from their response to the new environment. Now, many of these customs and traditions, government, and way of life have come down to the present. So, meaning to say, it's still present today. Some of those traditions that we had on pre-colonial period. Despite the changes brought about the westernization and modernization, this is why it is possible to know about our distant past by simply observing some customs and practices that have resisted change and modernization. Now, you might get curious about what happened from the past. So let's move on to the next slide, which is the pre-colonial or the social classes under pre-colonial period. So I want you to observe the triangle. Okay, observe the triangle. So as you can see from the triangle, we have the Maharlikas, Timawas, Alipin, and divided into two types of alipin. First, aliping namamahay. Second is aliping sagili. So I know that from your previous years, as I've just mentioned a while ago, in your araling panlipunan subject, this has been tackled already by your teachers. So let's try to move on to the definition of maharlika. It's just like a review of your previous lesson from your araling panlipunan. Now, maharlikas, who were composed of rulers and their families, occupied the highest class. They were usually addressed as Gat, Lakan, Raha, or Datu. Right? Now, those are under the high class society during the pre-colonial period. Now, second is we have the Timawas, were the worker class. Middle class, they were considered as the warrior class and sometimes called free men, Timawas or free men in English. They, however, were required to render military service to the Datu when called upon and are also obliged to agriculture labor as needed. So meaning to say it's way different from the Maharlikas because Maharlikas somehow they're nobles, they are rich, however Timawas is just in the middle class, right? Now let's move on to this third type which is the Alipin. Alipin were divided into two, alipin na mamahay and alipin sa dilim. Now, what is meant of alipin na mamahay? Alipin na mamahay were not full-fledged slaves. They had their own respective families and their own houses. They were required to serve their masters or the noble or the maharlikas only during planting and harvesting period.